I still remember the exact weight of the envelope in my hands. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of grey London morning where the sky presses down on you like it's trying to push you into the ground. And I was standing in the lobby of Callaway Industries, the company I had given 12 years of my life to, holding a manila envelope that contained two things: a termination letter accusing me of embezzling £473,000, and a formal notice that criminal proceedings were being considered against me. My hands weren't shaking. That's what I remember most clearly. They should have been shaking, but they weren't. They were steady, almost unnaturally so, because some part of my brain had already understood what was happening even before the words fully registered. The man I had trusted more than anyone outside my own family, the man who had mentored me, promoted me, stood beside me at my wedding, and held my firstborn daughter in his arms, had just destroyed my entire life with a single, calculated lie. Richard Callaway, CEO of Callaway Industries, my boss of 12 years, and the closest thing I had to a father figure since my own dad died when I was 19, had framed me for a crime I didn't commit. And standing in that lobby, with security guards flanking me like I was some kind of dangerous criminal, watching my former colleagues avoid eye contact as they hurried past, I made a silent promise to myself. I was going to find out why he had done this. I was going to prove my innocence. And I was going to make him pay for every single lie he had ever told me. To understand how I ended up in that lobby, holding that envelope, I need to take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of my career, though that's part of it, but the beginning of my relationship with Richard Callaway. I was 22 years old when I first walked through the doors of Callaway Industries, fresh out of university with a degree in business management and absolutely no connections in the corporate world. I had grown up in Brixton, the son of a bus driver and a school dinner lady, and everything I had achieved through sheer determination and hard work. My parents couldn't afford to send me to private school or pay for tutors or any of the advantages that my classmates seemed to take for granted. What they gave me instead was a work ethic that bordered on obsessive and an unshakable belief that if I just worked hard enough, I could become anything I wanted to be. And what I wanted to be, more than anything, was successful. Not for the money, though that was certainly part of it, but for the security, for the knowledge that my future children would never have to worry about whether there was enough food on the table or whether the heating bill would get paid that month. For the ability to look at myself in the mirror and know that I had made something of myself. Callaway Industries was a mid-sized logistics company based in East London. Not glamorous but solid, the kind of company that formed the backbone of British commerce without ever making headlines. They were hiring for an entry-level position in their operations department, and I applied along with what I later learned were nearly 300 other candidates. I shouldn't have made it past the first round of interviews. I didn't have the polish or the connections that the other candidates had. But something happened during my final interview that changed everything. Richard Callaway himself decided to sit in on the session. He was the CEO, which meant he had absolutely no reason to be interviewing a 22-year-old kid for a junior position, but he had apparently taken an interest in my application. Later, he told me it was because he recognized something in my background that reminded him of his own father, who had founded the company after immigrating from Ireland with nothing but the clothes on his back. At the time, I just knew that the most powerful man in the building was looking at me with what seemed like genuine interest, asking me questions about my life and my goals and what I thought I could bring to the company. I must have said something right, because 3 days later, I received a call offering me the position. And just like that, my life changed forever. The first few years were exactly what I had hoped for. I worked harder than anyone else in my department, arriving before the sun came up and leaving long after it had set. I took on every assignment that was offered to me, no matter how tedious or how far outside my job description. I learned every aspect of the business, from warehouse operations to client management to financial planning. And through it all, Richard was there, guiding me, encouraging me, pushing me to be better than I thought I could be. He promoted me to team leader after 2 years. He made me operations manager after 5. By the time I turned 30, I was director of operations, reporting directly to him and overseeing more than 200 employees. My salary had increased exponentially. Sarah and I had bought a house in Greenwich, a proper house with a garden and a spare bedroom that we were already planning to turn into a nursery. We were talking about starting a family. My life was everything I had ever dreamed of, and I owed it all to Richard Calloway. Or at least, that's what I believed at the time. That's what Richard wanted me to believe. Because the truth, as I would eventually discover, was that Richard had been using me from the very beginning. He had recognized in me not just potential, but something more valuable: naivety, loyalty, a desperate hunger for approval that made me blind to the manipulation hiding behind every promotion, every pat on the back, every fatherly piece of advice. I was the perfect tool for his purposes, and he had been shaping me for over a decade, preparing me for the moment when he would need someone to take the fall for his crimes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the first time I noticed something was wrong. It was about 3 years before the day I was fired, maybe 6 months after my promotion to Director of Operations. I was reviewing some routine financial reports when I noticed a discrepancy. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a series of payments to a vendor I didn't recognize, something called Meridian Consulting Services. The amounts were relatively small, maybe 10 or 15,000 pounds per transaction, but there were a lot of them, spread out over several months. I flagged it for our CFO, Victor Chen, assuming it was probably just a clerical error or a vendor I hadn't been introduced to yet. Victor thanked me for catching it and said he would look into it. But when I checked the next quarterly report, the payments were still there. In fact, there were more of them now, and the amounts had increased. I raised the issue again, more forcefully this time, and Victor assured me that Meridian was a legitimate consulting firm that the company had recently engaged for some strategic planning work. He even showed me a contract that appeared to confirm this. I accepted his explanation because Victor had been with the company for 15 years, because Richard trusted him completely, and because I had no reason to believe that anyone would lie about something so easily verifiable. I put my concerns aside and focused on my own responsibilities. That was my first mistake. It wouldn't be my last. The next few years passed in a blur of work and domestic bliss. Sarah and I got married in a small ceremony at a country hotel in Kent. Richard was there, of course, sitting in the front row, like the proud father I wished I still had. He gave a speech at the reception that moved me to tears, talking about how he had watched me grow from a nervous kid into a confident leader, how I represented everything that was best about the company and about the immigrant dream that his own father had embodied. When our daughter Emma was born, 2 years later, Richard was one of the first people to visit us in the hospital. He held her in his arms with such tenderness that Sarah whispered to me that he would have made a wonderful grandfather. I believed it. I believed everything he showed me, because why would I question the man who had given me everything I had? The answer, of course, was that Richard hadn't given me anything. He had simply positioned me where he needed me to be, building my trust and my dependence so that when the time came, he could use me without resistance. And the time came sooner than I expected. Looking back, I can see all the warning signs that I missed. The way Richard started involving me more heavily in financial decisions that should have been outside my purview. The way he began having me sign off on documents and authorizations that I didn't fully understand, always with some plausible explanation about streamlining processes or reducing bureaucratic bottlenecks. The way he gradually shifted responsibility for certain accounts and transactions onto my shoulders, creating a paper trail that led directly to me. But at the time, I was flattered. I thought he was preparing me for even greater things, perhaps even grooming me to eventually succeed him as CEO. I never imagined that he was actually preparing me to be his scapegoat. The first real crack in my illusions came about 6 months before my termination. I was working late one evening, as I often did, when I decided to access a file that I had never had reason to open before. It was stored in a directory labeled Archive Projects, which I assumed contained old proposals and closed accounts. Most of the files were exactly what I expected, mundane administrative records from years past. But buried among them was a folder with a cryptic name that caught my attention. When I opened it, I found what appeared to be a duplicate set of financial records for the company, but with significant differences from the official reports I was familiar with. The numbers didn't match. There were accounts and transactions that didn't appear in the standard records, and amounts that had been systematically altered. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The discrepancies were too consistent to be errors. Someone had been keeping two sets of books, one for official purposes and one that reflected what was really happening with the company's money. I should have taken that evidence to the authorities immediately. I know that now. But at the time, I couldn't bring myself to believe what I was seeing. I told myself there had to be an innocent explanation. Maybe it was an old system that had been replaced. Maybe it was some kind of internal audit document that I wasn't meant to access. I certainly didn't want to believe that the company I had devoted my life to, the company run by the man I admired more than anyone, could be engaged in anything improper. So I copied the files onto a personal flash drive, locked them away in a safe at home, and tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't tell anyone. I just went back to work the next day and pretended that everything was normal. That was my second major mistake, and it almost cost me everything. The months that followed were characterized by a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite articulate. I found myself watching Richard more closely, looking for signs that something was wrong. And the more I watched, the more I noticed. There were meetings he attended that didn't appear on any official schedule. There were phone calls he took in hushed tones behind closed doors. There were visitors who came and went without being logged by reception. And there was Victor Chen, always hovering nearby, exchanging glances with Richard that suggested a level of communication I wasn't privy to. I started to feel like an outsider in my own company, like everyone else knew something I didn't. But whenever I tried to raise the subject, whenever I asked pointed questions about the decisions being made or the direction the company was taking, I was met with reassurance and deflection. Richard would smile that warm, fatherly smile of his and tell me not to worry about things above my pay grade. Victor would clap me on the shoulder and remind me that some matters were handled at the executive level for good reasons. And I would nod and go back to my office, feeling like a paranoid fool for suspecting people who had only ever shown me kindness. Then came the day that changed everything. It started like any other Tuesday. I arrived at the office early, reviewed my schedule, attended a series of routine meetings. Around noon, I was called to Richard's office for what I assumed was a standard check-in. But when I walked through the door, I knew immediately that something was different. Richard wasn't alone. Victor was there, along with two people I didn't recognize, a stern-looking woman in an expensive suit and a younger man carrying a briefcase. Richard's expression was grave, none of the usual warmth in his eyes. He gestured for me to sit down, and then he said words that I will never forget for as long as I live. Marcus, I'm afraid we have a very serious situation. An internal audit has revealed significant financial irregularities in accounts under your supervision. Funds have been misappropriated, contracts have been manipulated, and the trail leads directly to you. I don't remember exactly what I said in response. I know I protested. I know I asked for specifics, demanded to see the evidence, insisted that there had to be some mistake. The woman in the suit, who introduced herself as the company's external legal counsel, showed me documents that appeared to confirm everything Richard had said. Authorization forms with my signature, bank transfers from accounts I had access to, contracts with Meridian Consulting Services that bore my initials. The evidence was overwhelming and, from an outsider's perspective, completely damning. And the worst part was that some of it was real. Those were my signatures, my authorizations, my initials. Richard had been feeding me documents to sign for years, documents I had trusted because they came from him. He had created a paper trail so convincing that even I couldn't deny my own handwriting, staring back at me from every page. Richard spoke to me with what sounded like genuine sadness, expressing his disappointment, saying he had never imagined I could betray his trust like this. He said the matter would be referred to the police and that I was suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Security guards appeared at the door. My company ID was confiscated. I was escorted to my office to collect my personal belongings, watched every second like a common criminal. And then I was led through the building, past colleagues who wouldn't meet my eyes, past the receptionist who had smiled at me every morning for 12 years, out through the lobby and into the grey London morning. The doors closed behind me, and just like that, 12 years of my life were over. The next few weeks were the darkest I have ever experienced. The police interviewed me multiple times, each session more grueling than the last. The evidence against me was extensive and detailed, a testament to how thoroughly Richard and Victor had prepared their trap. My lawyer, a criminal defense specialist recommended by a friend, told me frankly that the case looked very bad. The financial trail was clear. The documents bore my genuine signatures. Unless I could prove that I had been deliberately set up, I was looking at a lengthy prison sentence. The charges included fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty, offenses that together carried a maximum penalty of 14 years. 14 years. The thought of spending 14 years in prison, of missing Emma's childhood, of losing Sarah, of having everything I had worked for ripped away because of a man I had trusted like family, was almost more than I could bear. Sarah was my rock during those terrible weeks. She never doubted me for a second, not when my name appeared in the newspapers, not when friends stopped calling, not when her own family suggested that perhaps she should distance herself from me until the situation was resolved. She held me when I broke down in the middle of the night. She reminded me who I was when I started to doubt myself. And she was the one who finally pushed me to stop wallowing in despair and start fighting back. "You're the smartest, most hardworking man I've ever known," she told me one evening, after I had spent yet another day staring at the wall and feeling sorry for myself. "If Richard set you up, there has to be evidence. He's arrogant. Arrogant people make mistakes. Find the mistakes, Marcus. Find them and expose him for what he really is." She was right, of course. She was always right about the things that mattered. So I pulled myself together and started to fight. The first thing I did was retrieve the files I had copied months earlier, the duplicate financial records that had first raised my suspicions. I spent hours analyzing them, comparing them to the evidence that had been presented against me, looking for inconsistencies. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. The payments to Meridian Consulting Services, which had supposedly been authorized by me, appeared in the official records, but not in the shadow set. This suggested that someone had added them after the fact, manipulating the books to make it look like I was responsible. The bank accounts into which the embezzled funds had allegedly been transferred were registered to shell companies with addresses in offshore jurisdictions. I had no offshore accounts. I had barely traveled outside the UK. How could I possibly have set up a complex network of shell companies without anyone noticing? The more I dug, the more I found. Richard's signature appeared on documents that predated my involvement with the relevant accounts. Victor's name was on correspondence with Meridian that had been carefully excluded from the evidence used against me. There were gaps in the timeline, periods when funds had been moved, but I had been on holiday or attending conferences with dozens of witnesses who could confirm my whereabouts. The case against me was compelling at first glance, but it was built on a foundation of selective information and deliberate omissions. Someone had gone to great lengths to frame me, but they hadn't been perfect. There were cracks in the facade, and I was determined to widen them until the whole structure collapsed. But I knew that what I had wouldn't be enough on its own. The evidence I was gathering was circumstantial at best. It suggested that I might have been framed, but it didn't prove who had framed me or why. For that, I needed more. I needed someone on the inside who could access information I no longer had access to. I needed help from someone who knew the company's inner workings, but wasn't part of whatever conspiracy Richard and Victor had constructed. And that's when I thought of Diana Reyes. Diana was a junior accountant who had joined the company about 3 years earlier. I had always been impressed by her work ethic and her attention to detail, and I had recommended her for promotion more than once. She was quiet and unassuming, the kind of person who blended into the background at company events and was easy to overlook. But I remembered a conversation we had once had, a rare moment of personal connection at a company Christmas party. She had told me about growing up in a rough part of Birmingham, about working multiple jobs to put herself through university, about knowing what it felt like to be underestimated and overlooked. She reminded me of myself, or at least of the person I had been before I started climbing the corporate ladder, and I had a feeling, based on nothing more than instinct, that she might be willing to help me. Reaching out to Diana was risky. If she was loyal to Richard, or if she simply didn't want to get involved, she could report my contact to the company and give them more ammunition to use against me. But I was running out of options, and my instinct told me that she was worth the risk. I tracked down her personal email address through mutual acquaintances and sent her a carefully worded message. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't ask her to do anything illegal. I simply said that I believed I had been wrongly accused and that I was looking for someone who might be willing to help me understand what had really happened. I included my phone number and said I would understand completely if she chose not to respond. And then I waited. 3 days passed with no reply. I was starting to give up hope when my phone rang late one evening, displaying a number I didn't recognize. I answered it, and Diana's voice came through the line, quiet but determined. "Mr. Thompson, it's Diana Reyes. I've been thinking about your email. I think we should talk." We met at a coffee shop in Stratford, a place far enough from the company's offices that we were unlikely to be seen by anyone we knew. Diana was nervous, I could tell, constantly glancing at the door and speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. But what she told me changed everything. She said she had noticed irregularities in the company's accounts for months, small things at first, but increasingly difficult to ignore. Payments that didn't match invoices, expenses that couldn't be verified, and documents that appeared and disappeared from the system without explanation. She had raised her concerns with her supervisor, who had told her to mind her own business. She had considered going to Victor, but something about the way he deflected questions made her uncomfortable. And then I had been accused and fired, and she had watched the whole thing unfold, with a growing sense that something wasn't right. The evidence against me seemed too neat, too complete, like it had been assembled specifically to create a convincing narrative. And some of the documents that had been used to incriminate me, she knew for a fact, hadn't existed in the system until after my suspension. This was the breakthrough I had been hoping for. Diana's testimony wouldn't be enough to prove my innocence on its own, but combined with what I had already gathered, it painted a picture of systematic fraud and deliberate frame-up. I asked Diana if she would be willing to help me gather more evidence, and she agreed without hesitation. "I didn't get where I am by being a coward," she said, with a determination that reminded me why I had always believed in her. "If Richard Calloway is dirty, then someone needs to expose him. And if you're innocent, which I believe you are, then you deserve to have your name cleared." Over the next few weeks, Diana became my eyes and ears inside Calloway Industries. She was careful, incredibly careful, never doing anything that could be traced back to her or that would put her in legal jeopardy. But she was also resourceful, finding ways to access information that should have been beyond her clearance level and documenting everything she found. The picture that emerged was even worse than I had imagined. Richard hadn't just been embezzling money from the company. He had been running a massive fraud scheme for over a decade, siphoning funds through a network of shell companies that ultimately led back to offshore accounts under his control. Meridian Consulting Services was the centerpiece of the operation, a phantom company that existed only on paper and whose sole purpose was to receive payments for services that were never rendered. And Victor Chen was his accomplice, manipulating the books and covering the tracks while taking his own substantial cut of the proceeds. The total amount stolen was staggering. Diana's preliminary estimates suggested it was in the tens of millions of pounds, enough to fund Richard's lavish lifestyle, his country estate, his collection of vintage cars, all the trappings of wealth that I had always assumed came from legitimate success. But what made me truly sick to my stomach was the realization of how long this had been going on. Richard had been stealing from the company his own father had built, betraying the legacy of the man whose memory he claimed to honor for more than 15 years. And when the scheme had finally grown too large to sustain, when the risk of discovery had become too great, he had found the perfect solution: find someone else to blame, someone loyal, someone trusting, someone who had been carefully positioned over many years to take the fall.
Me. The rage I felt when I fully understood what Richard had done was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't hot or explosive, it was cold, crystalline, a fury that sharpened my mind rather than clouding it. I had trusted this man with my career, my future, my family's security. I had looked up to him as a mentor and father figure, and he had been planning to destroy me for years, treating me as nothing more than a disposable tool in his grand scheme. Every kind word he had ever spoken to me, every pat on the back, every expression of pride in my accomplishments had been a lie, a manipulation designed to keep me loyal and compliant until the moment he needed to sacrifice me. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it fundamentally changed how I saw the world. I had always believed that if you worked hard and treated people with integrity, you would be rewarded. Richard had shown me that there were people who would exploit your decency, who would turn your trust into a weapon against you, and he had shown me that the only way to fight such people was to be smarter and more patient than they were. I was gathering evidence, building my case, preparing to take everything I had learned to the authorities. But I knew that what I had still wasn't enough. The evidence was compelling, but a skilled lawyer could argue that it was circumstantial, that I was grasping at straws to deflect blame for my own crimes. I needed something irrefutable, something that would prove beyond any doubt that Richard was guilty and that I was innocent. I needed to find the smoking gun that would blow his entire operation apart, and I had no idea where to look for it. The answer came from an unexpected source. About a month into my investigation, I received a letter at my home address. It was handwritten on expensive stationery, and the signature at the bottom was one I recognized immediately: Margaret Calloway, Richard's mother and the widow of the company's founder. I had met her only a handful of times over the years, at company functions and formal events. She was a formidable woman in her late 70s, sharp and perceptive despite her advanced age, and she had always treated me with a distant but genuine kindness. The letter was brief and enigmatic. It said that she had heard about my situation and that she believed there was more to the story than had been publicly revealed. It invited me to visit her at her home in Surrey at my earliest convenience, and it urged me to come alone. I discussed the letter with Sarah, who was understandably suspicious. For all we knew, it could be a trap, a way for Richard to lure me into a situation where he could further incriminate me. But something about the letter felt genuine, and my instincts had served me well so far. I decided to take the risk. 3 days later, I drove to Surrey and found myself standing at the gates of a grand old manor house that had been in the Calloway family for generations. A housekeeper led me through elegant hallways to a sitting room where Margaret was waiting, dressed in black as if in mourning and looking every day of her age. She gestured for me to sit, studied me for a long moment with eyes that missed nothing, and then she began to speak. What she told me over the next 2 hours changed everything. Margaret had known for years that something was wrong with her son. She had watched him grow from a charming child into a ruthless adult, and she had seen glimpses of the darkness beneath his polished exterior. But she had never had proof, never had anything concrete to justify the suspicions that had haunted her. Until recently. About 6 months earlier, Margaret had discovered a hidden compartment in her late husband's old desk, one that she had never known existed. Inside was a file that Patrick Calloway had apparently compiled in the years before his death, a file that documented his own concerns about Richard's activities. Patrick had noticed the financial irregularities years ago, but Richard was his only child, his heir, the continuation of everything he had built. So instead of confronting Richard or going to the authorities, Patrick had quietly gathered evidence and hidden it away, perhaps hoping that he would never have to use it, perhaps unable to face the implications of what his son had become. Patrick had died before he could decide what to do, and the evidence had remained hidden for over a decade. Until now. Margaret handed me the file, and as I leafed through its contents, I realized that I was holding the smoking gun I had been searching for. There were bank statements linking Richard to the offshore accounts. There were signed contracts that proved his direct involvement in the Meridian scheme. There were photographs of Richard meeting with individuals who had later been identified in fraud investigations in other countries, and there was a handwritten note from Patrick himself, dated just weeks before his death expressing his suspicion that Richard was planning to frame one of his loyal employees if the scheme ever started to unravel. Patrick hadn't known it would be me, but he had known that someone would eventually pay for his son's crimes. I asked Margaret why she was helping me, why she was willing to betray her own son. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with grief. Patrick built that company with his own hands. He sacrificed everything to create something that would endure, something our family could be proud of, and Richard has spent the last 15 years destroying it, stealing from it, corrupting everything it was supposed to stand for. If Patrick were alive, he would never have allowed this to continue. He would have stopped Richard, no matter the cost. I am too old and too sick to do what needs to be done, but you are not. Take this evidence. Use it. Make my son face the consequences of what he has done, for Patrick, for the company, for all the people Richard has hurt. I left Margaret's house with the file clutched in my hands, and a clarity of purpose I had never experienced before. The path forward was clear. I had everything I needed to bring Richard down, to prove my innocence, and to ensure that justice was finally served. But I had to be strategic. I had to move carefully, anticipating every possible countermove, ensuring that there was no way for Richard to wriggle free of the trap that was closing around him. I was not going to give him a second chance to destroy me. This time, I would be the one in control. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of preparation and timing. Working with my lawyer, I organized all the evidence into a comprehensive dossier. Diana continued to gather corroborating information from inside the company. Sarah helped me anticipate how Richard might respond and plan for every contingency. We coordinated with a journalist I trusted, a senior reporter at a major national newspaper who specialized in corporate fraud investigations, and we identified a sympathetic contact within the Serious Fraud Office who could ensure that the authorities would take our evidence seriously. Every piece of the puzzle was positioned with precision, ready to fall into place at the right moment. I also did something that I will admit was perhaps petty, but that felt deeply necessary for my own sense of justice. I reached out to every person I could find who had been harmed by Richard over the years. The former employee who had been fired for raising questions about financial irregularities and was now working in a dead-end job in Manchester. The business partner who had been forced out through manufactured disputes and had never recovered professionally. The whistleblower who had tried to report misconduct years ago and had been publicly discredited and quietly destroyed. I contacted all of them, shared what I had learned, and asked if they would be willing to add their voices to mine. Not all of them agreed. Some were too afraid, too damaged, too exhausted to reopen old wounds, but many said yes, and their stories added depth and weight to the case I was building, painting a picture of a man who had spent decades using and discarding people for his own benefit. The day I chose to strike was Richard's 60th birthday. He was hosting a lavish party at the company headquarters, a celebration of his decades of supposed leadership and success. Everyone who mattered in the British business community would be there. The press would be covering the event. It was the perfect stage for what I had planned. I arrived at the building just as the party was getting underway, dressed in my best suit and carrying a leather briefcase containing copies of every document I had assembled. Security tried to stop me at the door, of course. I was still technically banned from the premises, but I had anticipated that. I had arranged for James Porter, an external auditor I had contacted weeks earlier, to meet me at the entrance with credentials that obliged the company to allow him access. And since I was accompanying him as a consultant on an urgent matter, they had no legal grounds to exclude me. The look on the security guards' faces as I walked past them was the first moment of satisfaction I had experienced in months. The party was in full swing when I entered the main conference hall. Richard was standing at the center of a group of admirers, regaling them with some anecdote about the company's early days. He looked every inch the successful executive, distinguished and confident and completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. I stood at the edge of the crowd and waited, and then, at precisely the moment I had planned, my phone buzzed with a message from Diana. It's done. What Diana had done, at that exact moment, was release a comprehensive packet of evidence to every major news outlet in the country. The documents, the testimonies, the financial records, all of it was now in the hands of journalists who were already writing the stories that would appear on every front page by morning. There was no way to suppress it, no way to spin it, no way for Richard to maintain the facade he had spent decades constructing. The truth was out. I made my way through the crowd toward Richard, and I watched his face as his phone began to buzz with frantic messages. I saw the confusion turn to concern, turn to dawning horror as he realized that something was terribly wrong. And then he looked up and saw me standing there, and for just a moment, the mask slipped completely. I saw the real Richard Calloway, the man behind the charm and the warmth and the fatherly concern. I saw a ruthless, calculating, utterly amoral creature who had never cared about anyone but himself. And I smiled. "Hello, Richard," I said, loud enough for those around us to hear. "I thought I would come wish you a happy birthday. I brought you a present." I opened my briefcase and handed him a single sheet of paper. It was a summary of the evidence against him, a preview of what the newspapers would be publishing within hours. He stared at it, his face growing pale, and then he looked back at me with an expression that was almost unreadable. Rage, fear, disbelief, all of those, perhaps, and more. "You have no idea what you've done," he said quietly. "Actually," I replied, "I know exactly what I've done. I've exposed you for what you really are. Everything you stole, everyone you hurt, all the lies you told, it's all going to come out. The police are already on their way, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Richard had shown me that there were people who would exploit your decency, who would turn your trust into a weapon against you, and he had shown me that the only way to fight such people was to be smarter and more patient than they were. I was gathering evidence, building my case, preparing to take everything I had learned to the authorities, but I knew that what I had still wasn't enough. The evidence was compelling, but a skilled lawyer could argue that it was circumstantial, that I was grasping at straws to deflect blame for my own crimes. I needed something irrefutable, something that would prove beyond any doubt that Richard was guilty and that I was innocent. I needed to find the smoking gun that would blow his entire operation apart, and I had no idea where to look for it. The chaos that erupted in the conference hall was something I'll never forget. Within minutes of my confrontation with Richard, phones were buzzing everywhere as news of the breaking story spread through the crowd. Guests began checking their devices, and I watched expressions shift from confusion to shock to appalled fascination as they read the headlines. Callaway Industries CEO accused of massive fraud. Whistleblower reveals 15-year embezzlement scheme. Innocent employee framed as scapegoat. The story was everywhere, impossible to ignore, impossible to suppress, and at the center of it all, Richard Calloway stood frozen, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Victor Chen was the first to try to escape. I spotted him moving toward a side exit, his face the color of ash, his expensive suit suddenly looking rumpled and disheveled. But he didn't get far. The police had been waiting outside, alerted by my lawyer hours earlier, and they intercepted him before he reached the street. I later learned that he had tried to make a deal immediately, offering to testify against Richard in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was exactly what I had expected from a man whose loyalty had always been for sale to the highest bidder. Richard attempted a different approach. Even as guests began edging away from him and staff members stared in horrified silence, he tried to maintain his composure. He called for quiet, raised his hands in a gesture of calm authority, and began to speak in that smooth, persuasive voice that had convinced so many people of so many lies over the years. "There has clearly been some misunderstanding," he said. "I don't know what these accusations are about, but I assure you that I will address them fully and transparently. In the meantime, I ask for your patience and your trust as we get to the bottom of this unfortunate situation." But for once, his words had no power. The evidence was too comprehensive, too damning, too meticulously documented. The crowd didn't rally to his defense or murmur sympathetically. They stared at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to disgust. And when the police entered the conference hall moments later and asked Richard to accompany them for questioning, no one protested. No one called out in support. He was escorted out of his own birthday party like a common criminal, which, of course, was exactly what he was. I stayed until the police had taken both Richard and Victor away. I answered questions from officers who had been briefed on my role in the investigation. I watched as company employees huddled in shocked groups, trying to process the revelation that the man they had followed for years was a fraud and a thief. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel: emptiness. For months I had been driven by the need for justice, the determination to prove my innocence and expose Richard's crimes. Now that it was finally happening, I thought I would feel triumphant, vindicated, perhaps even happy. Instead, I just felt tired. The anger that had sustained me was draining away, leaving behind a hollow space that would take time to fill. Sarah was waiting for me when I got home that night. She had been watching the news coverage, following every development, and she ran to me the moment I walked through the door. We held each other for a long time without speaking, and when she finally pulled back to look at me, I saw tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she said. "It's finally over." "Not quite," I replied. "There's still the trial, the investigation, a lot more to come before we can really put this behind us." But she was right in the ways that mattered most. The worst was over. The truth was out. And no matter what happened next, I would never again be the naive, trusting person who had walked into Richard Calloway's trap. I had been forged by the experience, hardened and sharpened, transformed into someone who understood the world more clearly than I ever had before. It was a painful education, but it was one I would never forget. The investigation that followed Richard's arrest was extensive and thorough. The Serious Fraud Office took the lead, working alongside police detectives and forensic accountants to unravel 15 years of systematic theft and deception. What they found exceeded even my expectations. The total amount embezzled from Callaway Industries was ultimately calculated at over £47 million, an almost incomprehensible sum that had been siphoned off through hundreds of transactions and hidden in a labyrinth of offshore accounts. The scheme had involved not just Richard and Victor, but a network of accomplices including lawyers, bankers, and corporate service providers who had helped facilitate the fraud in exchange for their own cuts of the proceeds. By the time the investigation was complete, more than a dozen individuals had been arrested and charged with various offenses. The evidence that Margaret Calloway had provided proved to be crucial. Patrick's file contained documentation that predated my involvement with the company by years, proving that the fraud had begun long before I could have been responsible. Combined with the evidence Diana and I had gathered, and the testimony of Victor Chen, who sang like a canary, once he realized the scale of the case against him, it painted an irrefutable picture of Richard's guilt. The charges I had been facing were dropped within weeks of Richard's arrest. I received a formal letter of apology from the Crown Prosecution Service acknowledging that I had been wrongly accused, and slowly, gradually, my reputation began to be rehabilitated in the eyes of the public and the business community. The trial itself was a spectacle. Richard, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, refused to plead guilty. He hired the most expensive legal team money could buy and mounted a defense that attempted to shift blame onto everyone else involved. He claimed that Victor had been the mastermind and that he himself had been deceived. He suggested that some of the evidence had been fabricated by enemies seeking to destroy him. He even, at one particularly desperate moment, implied that his late father had been the one who initiated the fraud and that he had simply been cleaning up the mess. None of it worked. The jury saw through his lies, as I knew they would. They had access to the same evidence I had gathered, the same documents, the same testimonies, the same undeniable proof of his guilt. And after 3 weeks of testimony and less than 8 hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all 37 counts he had been charged with. The sentencing hearing was held on a gray November morning, almost exactly 2 years after the day I had been handed that manila envelope in the lobby of Callaway Industries. I attended with Sarah, sitting in the public gallery and watching as Richard was brought before the judge to learn his fate. He looked older than I remembered, diminished somehow, as if the loss of his power and status had physically shrunk him. When the judge pronounced sentence, 18 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 12, Richard didn't react. He just stared straight ahead with that blank, unreadable expression I had seen once before, on the night I confronted him at his birthday party. And when he was led away in handcuffs, he didn't look back. He didn't acknowledge anyone in the courtroom. He simply disappeared through a door, and the chapter of my life that had been dominated by Richard Calloway finally came to an end. The aftermath of the trial brought its own challenges. Callaway Industries was placed into administration, its assets frozen pending the resolution of countless legal claims from defrauded investors and clients. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs, innocent people whose only crime was working for a company run by a criminal. I felt responsible for them, even though I knew intellectually that the blame lay with Richard, not with me. I did what I could to help, using the contacts I had built over the years to help former colleagues find new positions, providing references, offering support and advice to anyone who asked. But I knew that for many of them, the damage Richard had done would take years to overcome. Margaret Calloway died peacefully in her sleep about 6 months after the trial. I learned of her passing through the newspapers and felt a genuine grief for a woman I had barely known, but who had shown remarkable courage at the end of her life. Her will, which was made public after her death, contained a provision that surprised many people. She left the bulk of her estate to a charitable foundation established in her husband's name, with specific instructions that none of it should go to Richard. It was her final act of disowning the son who had betrayed everything she and Patrick had believed in. I like to think that wherever she is now, she knows that her courage made a difference. Diana Reyes became something of a hero in the aftermath of the scandal. The bravery she had shown in gathering evidence while still employed at the company was recognized by regulatory authorities, and she received a substantial whistleblower award that gave her financial security for the first time in her life. She used some of the money to complete an advanced degree in forensic accounting and eventually started her own consultancy, specializing in detecting corporate fraud. We stayed in touch over the years, and I was proud to watch her transform from the quiet, overlooked junior accountant I had first noticed into a confident professional whose expertise was sought by companies around the world. As for me, I had to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. The experience had changed me profoundly, and I knew I couldn't simply return to the corporate world as if nothing had happened. I had seen too much, learned too much, lost too much of my innocence to pretend that everything was normal. Sarah and I talked about it for a long time, weighing options, considering possibilities, trying to imagine what a meaningful life might look like after everything we had been through. In the end, I decided to use my experience to help others. I wrote a book about what had happened to me, a detailed account of the betrayal and my journey toward justice that became a bestseller and was eventually adapted into a documentary. The money from the book gave us financial security. But more importantly, the response from readers showed me that my story had touched something in people who had experienced their own betrayals, their own workplace injustices, their own encounters with charming predators like Richard Calloway. I started consulting with organizations on corporate ethics and governance, helping them identify and address the warning signs of fraud and corruption before they could take root. I gave talks at business schools and conferences, sharing what I had learned about the psychology of betrayal and the importance of maintaining skepticism even toward those we trust the most. And I became an advocate for whistleblower protections, working with legislators and regulators to strengthen the legal frameworks that protect people who come forward to expose wrongdoing. It wasn't the career I had imagined for myself when I was a young man full of ambition and hope, but it was a career that felt meaningful, that allowed me to transform the worst experience of my life into something that might prevent others from suffering the same fate. There were still difficult moments, of course. For years after Richard's conviction, I would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that it had all been a dream and that I was still trapped in the nightmare of being accused and abandoned. I underwent therapy to process the trauma, learning to recognize the triggers that could send me spiraling into anxiety and developing strategies to cope with them. Sarah and I had to work to rebuild the trust that had been damaged, not between us, but in my ability to trust myself, to believe in my own judgment after it had been so spectacularly exploited by someone I thought I knew. It was a long process, and some days it still feels like a work in progress. But there were moments of healing too. Emma grew from a toddler into a bright, curious, compassionate child who had no memory of the terrible time her parents had gone through. When she was old enough to understand, I told her a simplified version of the story, emphasizing the importance of integrity and the knowledge that doing the right thing sometimes comes with a cost, but is always worth it in the end. She listened with the solemn attention that children give to stories they sense are important, and when I finished, she hugged me and said that she was proud of me. It was one of the most meaningful moments of my life. I sometimes wonder what happened to the people who had stood by Richard, who had refused to see the truth even when it was staring them in the face. Some of them, I know, suffered consequences for their willful blindness. Board members who had failed in their oversight duties faced legal liability. Senior executives who had ignored warning signs found their careers tainted by association, but others simply moved on, slotting into new positions at new companies, their reputations somehow unsullied by their proximity to one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in recent British history. It frustrated me at first, this seeming lack of accountability for those who had enabled Richard's crimes through their negligence or complicity, but I eventually made peace with it. I couldn't control what happened to everyone involved. I could only control my own actions, my own choices, my own commitment to building something positive from the wreckage. Richard himself served 12 years of his 18-year sentence before being released on license. I learned of his release through the news media, and I will admit that it reopened some old wounds. The thought of him walking free, even after everything he had done, felt like an injustice that would never be fully resolved. But I also recognized that he had lost far more than just 12 years of freedom. He had lost his reputation, his wealth, his family name, everything he had spent his life accumulating. His mother had died without forgiving him. His father's legacy had been destroyed by his crimes. He would spend the rest of his days as a convicted fraudster, shunned by the business community he had once dominated, remembered only as a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. There is a kind of justice in that, even if it doesn't feel as complete as I might wish. The last time I saw Richard was at a business conference about 2 years after his release. I was giving a keynote speech on corporate ethics, and he was in the audience sitting in the back row with an expression I couldn't quite read. Defiance? Curiosity? Resentment? I don't know. I delivered my speech without acknowledging his presence, and when it was over, I gathered my notes and prepared to leave. But he intercepted me in the corridor, blocking my path with a thin smile that reminded me uncomfortably of the man I had once trusted so completely. "Marcus," he said, "quite the successful reinvention. I always knew you had potential." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who had tried to destroy me, who had used me and discarded me without a shred of remorse, and I realized that I felt nothing, not anger, not fear, not even satisfaction at his fall from grace. Just a kind of detached recognition that he was part of my past, a chapter that was closed and could not be reopened. "Richard," I said, "I hope you've learned something from everything that happened. I hope the time you spent thinking about what you did taught you something about the importance of integrity and the consequences of betrayal. But honestly, I don't care either way. You're not part of my life anymore. You're just someone I used to know." I walked past him without looking back, and as I stepped out into the sunlight, I realized that I meant every word. He wasn't my enemy anymore. He was just a reminder of how far I had come, how much I had survived, how strong I had become. The betrayal that had once felt like the end of everything had become, in retrospect, the beginning of a new and better life. Richard Calloway had tried to destroy me, and he had failed. Not because I was smarter or stronger or better than him, but because I had something he could never understand: people who loved me, principles I believed in, and the determination to keep fighting even when everything seemed lost. I wrote earlier that this story was about how my boss became my enemy. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that Richard was always my enemy. He just hid it behind a mask of mentorship and fatherly concern so convincing that I couldn't see the reality underneath. And when the mask finally came off, when I saw him for who he really was, I realized that the enemy I was truly fighting wasn't just him. It was the arrogance and entitlement and casual cruelty that allowed people like him to thrive, the willingness of others to look the other way because confronting the truth was too uncomfortable, the system that protected the powerful and punished those who dared to challenge them. That's the enemy I'm still fighting, in my own way, through my work and my advocacy and the story I've shared with you here. The thing I've learned from all of this is that betrayal doesn't have to define you. When someone you trust turns against you, when they try to destroy everything you've built and everything you are, it feels like the world is ending. It feels like nothing will ever be right again. But that's not true. The world keeps turning and you keep going, and eventually you find a way to build something new from the wreckage. Not the same as what you had before, but something that is yours in a way that what came before never was. Richard took a lot from me, but he didn't take my resilience or my capacity for hope. And in the end, those were the only things that mattered. Sarah and I celebrated our 15th wedding anniversary last year with a trip to the coast, just the two of us, leaving Emma with her grandparents for a long weekend. We walked on the beach and talked about everything we'd been through, all the challenges and the victories and the moments of doubt and the moments of grace. At one point, she turned to me and asked if I ever regretted what had happened, if I wished things had turned out differently. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "Sometimes," I said. "Sometimes I wish I had never met Richard Calloway, never trusted him, never given him the opportunity to hurt me. But then I think about who I've become because of what happened, the work I do, the people I've helped, the person I am now. And I realize that I wouldn't trade any of it. The pain was real, but so was the growth, and growth doesn't happen without pain." She squeezed my hand and smiled, and we walked on in comfortable silence watching the waves break against the shore. "My name is Marcus Thompson. I was betrayed by someone I loved and trusted. He tried to destroy me, and he failed. And now I spend my life helping other people make sure that the next person like him fails too. That's my story. That's my legacy. And if Richard Calloway ever reads these words, I want him to know that I think about him sometimes, not with anger or resentment, but with something like pity. Because while I have spent the years since his conviction building a life filled with meaning and connection and love, he has spent them alone, stripped of everything that once defined him, remembered only as a cautionary tale. I have a family who adores me, work that matters, a future full of possibility. He has nothing but memories of what he lost and the knowledge that he brought it all on himself. The truth was revealed. The betrayer faced consequences. Justice was served, and I survived to tell the story. That's how it ends. Not with dramatic confrontation or explosive revenge, but with something quieter and more profound, with a life well lived, with the knowledge that integrity matters, that truth eventually wins, that the people who try to destroy you can never take away the things that truly matter, with the peace that comes from knowing you did the right thing, even when it would have been easier to give up. If you take anything from my story, I hope it's this. No matter how dark things get, no matter how completely someone tries to destroy you, there is always a way forward. There is always hope. And sometimes the very thing that nearly breaks you becomes the foundation for something stronger than you ever imagined you could be. I was betrayed by my boss, and he became my enemy. But in the end, I won. Not because I destroyed him, though I suppose in a way I did, but because I refused to let his betrayal be the end of my story, and that made all the difference.